to 40 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. So with that, I will begin, and I'm going to share my screen. So actually I won't be able to see you and you won't be able to see me. So I'll sort of be hiding behind the medium, and I'll emerge in the end. So it should be fairly smooth. All right. So I hope you're all able to see this, and if you're not, then if somebody would just unmute their mic and let me know if they can't see it, that would be great. Okay, so my presentation today is titled Piecing Together the Everyday, Ceramics in Archaeological Context. And the sort of meaning of these expressions that I use should become clear in the course of the talk. Sherds of pottery litter the surface of archaeological sites across the world. To visitor and archaeologist alike, potsherds mark the space as worthy of attention. Sometime in the past, people were here, and this is their trace. The fact that ceramics are omnipresent at archaeological sites and serve as the very first indicator of occupation makes them central to the discipline. Yet, the very qualities that make ceramics crucial to archaeological work also make these fragmentary objects appear commonplace and unimportant. In today's session, I will introduce ceramics as a technology with a long and significant history, and discuss some of the interpretive frameworks archaeologists used to understand them. I will also introduce a set of approaches that foreground the labor of producing ceramics and take seriously the many ways in which ceramic vessels were central to activities such as the preparation and serving of food, storage, and trade, activities that are routine, social, and symbolic at the same time. Ceramic refers to fired clay, the first synthetic material created by humans. Although it is frequently thought that the first instances of ceramic production and use accompanied settled life, recent studies challenge these assumptions and point towards more diverse points of origin. For instance, research in East Asia, in China and Japan, as well as in Eastern Russia, shows that pottery technology emerged independently among hunter-gatherers well before the domestication of plants and the emergence of farming communities. That means that in these places, humans crafted and made use of ceramic pots long before they farmed. Studies of Japan's Jomon pottery from the 10th millennium BC, for instance. Sorry, I'm just, there we go. One of the oldest kinds of pottery identified in the world point towards a possible correlation between the use of ceramics and a fish-intensive diet. For instance, this pot that you can see right now on your screen was found in a shell mound in Japan, which also helps sort of bolster that correlation between communities of hunter-gatherers who also relied significantly on fish and seafood in their diet, and the origins of making and using pottery. It is apparent from these studies that human societies have a very long relationship with ceramic objects. The fact that this technology developed amongst communities living in diverse cultural, topographical, and geographical locales speaks to the versatility of fired clay as a material and the range of functions it can serve. When we speak of archaeological ceramics in India, we refer mostly to terracotta and earthenwares produced from about the 3rd millennium BC onwards, so much later, for instance, than these early examples from East Asia. These categories, terracotta and earthenware, refer to clay fired at relatively low temperatures, between about 700 to 900 degrees Celsius. As far as we know from archaeological contexts in southern India specifically, the bulk of ceramics found at any particular site were produced locally using available clays. Given the absence of archaeological traces of production sites, such as firing pits or kilns, it is assumed that production was fairly decentralized and significant investments in infrastructure were not made. It is from similar lack of evidence that we imagine the circulation of ceramic vessels as local. That is, there is no understanding that potters would have hawked their wares beyond local marketplaces. Whereas the production of pottery was conducted by specialized producers, which means people who were trained to be potters, the use of these objects is known to be widespread, cutting across lines of social and spatial hierarchies. This makes ceramic vessels a particularly powerful tool for understanding everyday life in the past. Produced locally from an inexpensive and easily available material, namely clay, used universally for a wide range of activities. The quantities of ceramics we find in the archaeological record are not only a testament to their widespread use, but to that material quality of breakage that we all encounter in our own lives when a plate cracks or a cup gets chipped in the kitchen sink. Ceramics break easily, but their fragments are virtually indestructible. They endure in the landscape for millennia, making archaeological knowledge production possible and giving us a sense of the sheer accumulation that societies in the past also lived with. So these are some images of a hill in Rome called Testaccio Hill, which is formed entirely of broken sherds of pottery. And interestingly, these sherds all come from the same kind of vessel, which is an amphora. Amphorae were vessels used to trade goods, and these and classical Roman archaeologists possess a very good sense of the different kinds of amphorae that circulated in the classical world, where these came from, the kinds of goods they carried, where they went. So the amphorae that form Testaccio Hill are all amphorae that came from Spain and carried olive oil in them. And this is just to give you a sense of how much the volume of ceramic use was and the kinds of very lasting effects that it has on the landscape. I think this would be equivalent to a modern day landfill, basically. So I hope to have given you a sense that ceramic objects were socially meaningful and crucial to several of the activities that sustain households and communities. With this background, it may come as a surprise that before any further analysis, ceramics are first and foremost a tool for establishing chronologies. Certain types of ceramic have come to be understood as indicative of a period of occupation, even though in the Indian context, the chronological boundaries of these periods of occupations are themselves quite poorly understood. Just as ceramics come to be anchored abstractly in time through this diagnostic act of identification, for instance, medieval ceramics or Iron Age ceramics, we lose sight of the social relations that were formed in their production, circulation, and use. In and of themselves, ceramics scarcely provide any access to objective time. They're not like pieces of carbonized wood that we can get a radiocarbon date from, or a piece of bone that we can use to through isotopic analysis to arrive at the date at which it may have been buried. They possess in and of themselves absolutely no correlation to time, which makes it very interesting that they have come to form over the years for archaeologists across the world the main kind of identifier of a chronological period. So their persistent use as chronological indicators is rooted in the history of the discipline of archaeology, especially in a time before the development of radiocarbon dating. I would like to speak briefly about this disciplinary history for a few reasons. The ways of thinking, knowing, and categorizing that define early 20th century archaeological practices are particularly entrenched in India and are inextricably tied to the history and functioning of an organization such as the Archaeological Survey of India. I hope that having a familiarization with the framework of culture history, which is the kind of mode of thinking and categorizing that was current across the world actually in the early 20th century and has remained very kind of sedimented in Indian archaeological practice. So I hope that having a familiarization with this particular way of thinking, which is called culture history, and its entailments will enable a deeper understanding of how the Indian past is presented to us in classrooms, in textbooks, in museums, and at monuments. Moreover, I think it is important to contextualize the study of ceramics within broader understandings of material culture and the archaeological record. Providing an account of some of these entrenched overarching frameworks will allow me to establish those relationships. So the Archaeological Survey of India, the ASI, was founded in 1861, taking the history of institutionalized archaeology in India as far back as the foundational moments of the discipline itself. The work of the ASI during the colonial period was focused primarily in the north. Excavations at some of the largest Bronze Age sites of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, as well as in the Indo-Gangetic plain, established the antiquity and sophistication of the Indian past. Excavations at Taxila and an interest in the Indo-Greek kingdoms of the Northwest made manifest how ancient India was far from being an isolated cultural entity. After all, the very people from whom the West traces its ancestry, namely the Greeks and the Romans, had long-standing and significant cultural, economic, and political relations with the Indian subcontinent. Southern India received relatively little attention during this time. Apart from the ruins of Vijayanagar, few places evince the grand scale and antiquity of the extensive urban settlements known in the north. Independence changed this. With the partition of India, many of the prized archaeological sites of the north fell in Pakistan. The newly independent nation needed to look elsewhere for its heritage. In 1947, Mortimer Wheeler began excavations at Brahmagiri with the intention of, I quote, opening up the south. In order to establish the archaeological history of southern India, taking it further back than what had been possible through the extensive epigraphical research performed by the archaeology departments of the Nizam of Hyderabad and the Wodeyar Kingdom of Mysore, it was important to conduct excavations at a site with a range of archaeological features that were understood to span a long period of time. In the absence of radiocarbon dating, these features helped anchor the excavator in a relative chronology. By excavating these features and identifying the other kinds of material culture that occurred in association with it, this is mostly ceramics, a chronology of occupation could be presented for other sites across the region that did not have these features, but where the same types of material culture were witnessed. So I'll try to make this a little bit less abstract. The primary archaeographic features in southern India are Ashmounds, Megaliths, and Ashokan Edicts. So this is what you're seeing here is an Ashmound, the kind of lower hill that you see in the foreground just behind the electricity pole. So these features are very interesting, and for a long time we didn't know what they were, but they were thought to be very, very old, and indeed they are. They're from the Neolithic period in southern India, which is roughly about 3rd millennium BC. They're basically accumulations of burnt cow dung. So Neolithic, during the Neolithic period in southern India, the rearing of cattle was an extremely important cultural and economic practice. And it appears that, that the excrement of the cattle was actually collected and burnt at very high temperatures, possibly in a series of episodes of accumulation, which would make these hills kind of higher and higher. And they would have been significantly taller than what they are now. They've been eroded both because of practices actually in the past. They were quarried for lime, and also modern day construction practices. Several of them have been cut because of road construction, also quarried again for the kind of raw material that they provide. So to name again the archaeographical features, we have ash mounds. we have megaliths, which is a very kind of enigmatic class of objects. Not objects, but structures, really. The name comes from really from a familiarity with European archaeology, in which during prehistoric times, structures using very large rocks were constructed as commemorative monuments. And in southern India, during the early colonial period, archaeologists identified these and were very interested in them precisely because they reminded them of something that they had seen in Europe. And so, it was possible to establish a connection with European civilization because they are actually unconnected. And the name megalith is often a misnomer. You can see that this is a structure that is actually composed of several rocks, liths, and they're not all very large in size. Actually, many of them are the size of cobbles. But megaliths come in various shapes and forms in southern India, and we're actually, some of them are clearly burial monuments, but many of them do not contain any human remains at all, and they may have commemorated a death, but they have a kind of very loose relationship with actual burial, but really have occupied a very important place, continue to occupy a very, very important place in the archaeology of South India. And finally, something that you'll all be familiar with, the Ashokan Edict. So by the early 20th century, there was a sense that Ashmounds came before megaliths and that Ashokan edicts came after megaliths. Textual sources had already established when the Emperor Ashoka lived, making edicts the most valuable feature for establishing chronology. It is crucial to note here that although a broad consensus existed on the ordering of these features, namely that Ashmounds precede megaliths, which precede Ashokan edicts, it was unknown for how long each of these were constructed, how long they remained in use, and the intervals of time that separated one from the other. And increasingly, research has made clear that the chronological boundaries that we have on both Ashmounds and megaliths are much more complex than this model would allow. Megaliths were not only constructed for a very long time, but as I said, actually the term megalith is something that brings together a number of practices of ritual commemoration, symbolic practice, and they have a very interesting relationship even with Ashmounds. We find sometimes megaliths in very close association with Ashmounds, burials that have been made into Ashmounds. So people were clearly interacting in each chronological period with the features of, what when we break time apart, what we think of as very distinct kind of cultures or periods of occupation. So features such as Ashmounds and megaliths, they form the cornerstones of the culture-historical approach to archaeology. Each feature is understood as the outward and material expression of a set of values and norms held in common by a group of people, that is, a culture. Other kinds of materials, most commonly ceramics, are understood to form an assemblage with that feature and can be identified as belonging to the same culture and time period. The tight association between people and the elements of material culture they used is exemplified to an extreme degree by the infamous term beaker folk, coined by V. Gordon Childe. We have several homegrown versions of this association in India: the painted greyware people, the red and blackware people, the megalithic people, and so on. This framework can be extremely problematic, especially for the interpretations of internal power relations and intercultural interaction that it assumes and promotes, which is a topic that I'll be happy to discuss further in the question and answer session if anybody's interested. I want to focus here on the implications for understanding time and cultural change. These are the elements of culture history that rely most significantly on ceramics and remain most entrenched within the instinctive, automatic, and somewhat unthought gestures at the heart of archaeological knowledge production. So under the culture historical framework, the people who made ashmounds and used a certain kind of pottery were thought to have been replaced by the megalithic culture. The megalithic culture came with its own set of ceramics, which are distinct from those associated with ashmounds. Ashokan edicts, which are taken as the marker of the early historic period, are known for the introduction of a new type of pottery, namely russet-coated painted ware. Each chronological period comes with its own distinct material cultures, which may not be, but is most often pottery. Each period transitions seamlessly into the next, creating the appearance of an uninterrupted continuum. But changes are in fact remarkably abrupt, considering they involve the wholesale replacement of one set of practices, lifeways, and objects with another. So to give you a sense of how this works in practice, I wanted to show you a stratigraphic section of one of the excavation units that Mortimer Wheeler opened at Brahmagiri, the site that I was speaking about, where there were both megaliths and an Ashokan edict, which kind of allowed Wheeler to anchor the occupation at Brahmagiri on these kind of known features. And so you see the stratigraphic section. It's a very, it is clearly an excavation unit that shows a very long period of occupation. The occupation is very layered, right? And this is what gets translated into chronology. So having separated each of the layers, so to speak, Wheeler has assigned each of them a chronological period, starting with what he calls a stone axe culture. The stone axe culture translates to what we call the Neolithic. The megalithic culture, which now in southern India is mostly called the Iron Age, and finally the Andhra culture, which we refer to as the early historic period, that is marked by the Ashokan edicts and russet-coated painted ware. And when he tries to create this chronology, you can see that there is actually overlap, right? I mean, the messiness of an archaeological unit does not allow him to make clear boundaries. But yet, when this research is presented as a finished product, what we land up with is a very clear sequence of objects and cultures, a very kind of clear-cut chronology that, as I said, represents time as if it were on a long continuum, with each period separated by clear breaks that can be identified. While it is, of course, possible to imagine a past during which groups annihilated one another and superimposed a particular way of life that was entirely different from what came before, I think it should be clear to us, both instinctively and from our knowledge of more recent history, that change is often a gradual phenomenon, marked both by shifts and by continuity, and something that occurs in a number of ways and for a range of reasons. It can be argued thus that although the culture historical approach anchors people and their practices in time, it presents a remarkably poor understanding of time itself. Time, in the sense of chronological periods, may last millennia and act as abstract containers for a suite of activities. By placing chronology center stage, we lose sight of the ways in which time was experienced and conceptualized, especially how the rhythms and durations of the very activities that are taken as representative of any given epoch may have influenced the ways in which people themselves marked time during their own time. Relying heavily on ceramics, as well as other material traces such as megaliths, it is also noticeable how little light is shed on the practices by which these traces were produced. What were the practices of building an ashmound or a megalith? Are these features internally differentiated, or do they appear standardized? What sorts of commemorative, social, or symbolic value might these practices have had? Were they located within human settlements or away from them? How might people have experienced a landscape dotted with these monuments? Similarly, in the case of ceramics, what were the practices by which ceramic vessels were produced? Who used them and in what ways? Are there distinct patterns of difference between ceramic vessels used for different kinds of activities or used in different social contexts? These are all questions that the culture historical approach to archaeology simply cannot get at. But very different narratives can become possible when the materials themselves are placed center stage, not as proxies for a culture, but as products that are the result of human labor. If the commonplace notion that ceramics are indicators of chronology creates an expectation that these objects are tools for producing some kind of meta-narrative, I would like to propose a different point of departure. The richest approaches to archaeological ceramics, I find, begin with the materiality of the sherds themselves and are rooted in the archaeological context in which these sherds are found. So if we were all in the same room, I would probably pass around some of the ceramics excavated at MASKI, the archaeological site in northern Karnataka where I conduct my own research and actually where the sherds that you see on your screen are from. These were excavated at a medieval settlement that was occupied during the 13th to 14th centuries CE. You would notice that these broken sherds are mostly gray, black, or beige. A few may be red or brown. Many of them are very small, less than a centimeter on a side. These are the features that an archaeologist working with ceramics would note. All analysis of ceramics proceeds from the physical. The analytical challenge is to keep in mind the social significance of these physical attributes. The physical attributes of ceramic vessels, their appearance as black or gray or red, the gloss of their surface, decorative elements such as incised lines or impressed motifs, their shape and size, the thickness of the vessel walls, do not arise from these ceramics being megalithic or medieval, and are not the necessary outward expression of a shared cultural ethos. These features arise from the work that potters did to make them. Practices of labor are in themselves cultural and thus contingent. Laboring bodies contend with the particular qualities of the materials that they deal with, clay in the case of ceramics, developing gestures both individual and learned as they transform raw material into finished product. Making a pot is a process composed of many disparate acts. At the most basic level, potters must collect and process clay, prepare a paste, shape a vessel, dry it, and fire it. Each step of the way presents multiple options or different ways of doing. Potters may access multiple sources of clay or have somebody else collect the clay for them. They may process it at the source or bring it to their place of work. Different instruments may be used to grind or crush clods of clay, or they may soak the clay in a substance that helps loosen the clumps. If the clay has impurities, does the potter remove them or let them be? When preparing the paste, do potters temper the clay with other elements to make the material easier to work or to lend finished pots a desirable appearance? How are tempers produced and processed? Is the paste prepared by hand, by foot, by the potter, or by somebody else? Vessels can be shaped on a wheel or by hand. Hand-built ceramics can be shaped using a base as a mold, using a mold as a base, and building the body by adding coils of clay. These may be smoothed by hand using some water and a soft material such as cloth, or using a paddle and anvil. Here you see the potter using a paddle on a pot that has been on clay that has basically been stretched over a mold. Alternatively, potters may add clay in a different way or make greater use of molds, as you see in this image. They may use a variety of methods to produce a single pot. Once the vessel is shaped, the potter may decorate it either when it is still quite wet or when it has dried and become more firm. They may add color by applying paint or a slip. Pots may be dried indoors or outdoors, slowly in order to avoid cracks, or less gradually, depending on the weather. They may be fired at a high temperature in a controlled environment such as the kiln, or in a less stable situation such as a pit or a pile. Firing is one of the most risky steps in the process of production, and one that requires the greatest input of resources. It may be somewhat ritualized, or perhaps conducted in common. In other words, potters may pool resources to build an infrastructure of firing and organize production in concert with one another. In Bangalore's Pottery town, for instance, potters come together in an association to build, maintain, and operate kilns for firing their wares. Potters have their own workshops, but act together for the final stage of the production process. So here you see one of the kilns in one of these kind of communally managed kilns in Pottery Town in Bangalore. And these are unfired small coolers, basically tea drinking cups, that have just been that are dry enough that they won't be damaged when they're just piled into the kiln like this. And then once the kiln is full, it will be closed and the pots will be fired. Here is another image that shows how these kilns are arranged. There are 3 of them, and they are just basically regularly managed by a revolving roster of potters. A roster of potters' names and the dates for their upcoming turn to fire their wares is evidence of the professional forms of association within the community. That's what you're seeing here. These are testament to only one of the many ways in which labor is formative of social relations. From my brief description of the process of making ceramics, it would seem the possibilities for differences are endless. These are circumscribed by the fact that ways of making, decisions taken about how to sequence operations and conduct them, are moored in cultural conceptions. This is not to say that pottery or other crafts are intrinsically unchanging and traditional, locked into some kind of static culture, but rather to suggest that potters work with methods made available to them as an inheritance. There is plenty of space for innovation and improvisation, and the embodied nature of this work means that the bodily gestures of each individual potter may be different. Yet, through forms of acculturation such as apprenticeship, as well as a conscious and unconscious knowledge of how different kinds of vessels should look, potters in any given society produce containers with recognizable forms and familiar appearances. The physical attributes of potsherds, which I described as the starting point for any analysis of archaeological ceramics, hold a key towards understanding the cultural practices of labor by which vessels were made. Potters do not operate in a vacuum, however. Their modes of production are in dialogue with users of ceramic vessels, who likely have certain expectations for how vessels should appear and what kinds of vessels should go together. Should also be mentioned here that potters too are users of ceramic vessels. They are both producers and consumers. For instance, in a house, one may want lamps for lighting, a globular jar for storing water, which is in Hindi called a ghada or a lota, one that is fairly open for preparing foods that need to be cooked down. One might also want a set of vessels in which to serve food, such as large and small plates, bowls, and the like. It is possible and very likely that a single vessel may have fulfilled a variety of purposes which are not accessible to the archaeologist. What the archaeologist does access, however, are spatial contexts of use. We find ceramics in domestic contexts as well as in smaller, more ephemeral settings such as field stations. We see them in places where people would have come together, for instance, around wells or bodies of water, where water would have been collected in clay vessels. We find copious volumes of potsherds discarded in rubbish heaps or other extramural spaces. We also find them in ritual settings. Think of a temple, for instance, where lamps are lit and food is prepared and served to gods and devotees. Commensality is also central to events that may not be closely associated with an ostensibly sacred space, say, following a ceremony such as a wedding or a funeral. The assemblage, that is, the range of vessel types found in any given spatial context, give us a sense of how different kinds of ceramics were used. Were certain kinds of vessels discarded more than others? Do ceramics found in a domestic context look similar to those excavated at, say, an outdoor communal space? Within each space, does the assemblage shift over time, or does it remain fairly conservative? As an example, we can think through this very specific archaeological context that is particularly rich in ceramics. This is a burial, probably dating to about 1000 BC. It's a megalith. As you can see, the body was interred with several ceramic vessels. The body is, which is not exposed at this point in the excavation, lies under the rocks that are towards the top of the unit. So the vessels were stacked one on top of another and packed tightly by the side of the body. So here you only see about, I can see 4 vessels, but we found about 20 vessels in total. So you can imagine how tightly packed together they were and how they were sort of just stacked one on top of the other. Apart from the large globular pots that you see in this image, we also recovered smaller bowls, as well as a very special kind of vessel known as a dish on stand, which is sort of like, looks like a modern day cake stand, you know, a plate that is attached to a pedestal. It tells us nothing to think of this pottery as megalithic, since we are unable to distinguish it from what may be found at a settlement dating to the same period. Was a similar range of vessels found in dwellings, or is this a special burial set? Were potters commissioned to create a specific set of vessels for a burial? If so, how did this come to be culturally constructed? But what by this I mean, if this was created specifically for a burial, how did it come to be created that, you know, you have to have 3 globular pots and 2 bowls and 1 dish on stand, etc., or that you must have a range of vessels in each burial? How did this range come to be constructed as something that was meaningful when, you know, sending somebody off? If not, that is, if this is not if this is not a specifically commissioned set of pottery, does the pottery and if this set of ceramics actually resembles the range of vessels we might find in a house of the same period, it raises questions about how death was conceptualized. Did the funeral imply that the deceased person would have at their disposal an assemblage of pots that made them feel at home? I will leave you all with these questions. Through this presentation, I've tried to draw your attention to the many ways in which ceramics are good to think with. Just as their ubiquity makes ceramics appear mundane and taken for granted tools for establishing a rough chronology, the great quantities in which we find them also lends them great analytical strength. As a discipline, archaeology involves the often difficult task of imagining how fragments from the past, which frequently resist easy interpretation, animated those social worlds of which they were a part. In the case of ceramics, I argue that staying close to the material and rooted in the context of its recovery opens up meaningful questions about some of the most routine yet socially significant practices of daily life. Not only the labor by which ceramics were crafted, but also the myriad activities for which they were used. Thank you. right.
Yeah. Ruti?
Thank you so much, Mannat. That was like really fascinating. Um,
Meera is not able to join, so I don't know if there were any questions. Okay. There was one question, I believe. How do you decide which ceramic to analyze?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It depends on it depends many times on the kind of approach that you take to ceramics in general. So what happens at most large excavations that are conducted in India is that a lot of the ceramics get discarded. We find enormous quantities of ceramics in excavation units. And so usually what is kept are the really large sherds and also pieces that are called diagnostics, which means that they're diagnostic of the vessel. So it'll be a piece of, say, the rim or the base of the vessel, or maybe a handle, or perhaps a decorated piece, which allows us to kind of place where in the vessel that piece would have gone, and so also to potentially reconstruct the form of that vessel. In the context where I work, we actually analyze all the ceramics. So when we excavate, all of the excavated material is passed through a screen, and all artifacts that can be identified in the screen that are larger than, I think, 1/8 of an inch, which is the size of the screen, are kept and then analyzed in some way. They depending on the research questions of the person who's analyzing them, they might choose to give certain pieces more attention than others, or to give certain kind of archaeological contexts more attention than others. But as a kind of almost as an ethics of research, I suppose, we actually keep all of the we retain all of the ceramics, and they are available to archaeologists for analysis.
Okay. Ayana wants to know, when talking of ash mounds, did you mean people associated with megaliths also built ash mounds?
No, I don't think they did. But they definitely saw them. They were, ash mounds by the time that people started building what are called megaliths, maybe around 1400, 1200 BC. Ash mounds would have been something that were a very visible feature in the landscape. And also a feature that, although they look kind of natural, they look like hills, but when you look a little more closely, you know that they're not. And it's understandable that, I mean, we can understand that people knew that just because of the ways in which they also mined these hills, and also tried to, in the words of some archaeologists, harvest their charisma, which means that, understanding that this was a feature in the landscape, to bury somebody inside an ash mound, by making a cut in the side of an ash mound, was obviously a kind of significant cultural practice.
Okay. There's another question from Arushi. What was the purpose of putting vessels in burial?
Yeah, your guess is as good as mine. It's so in these kind of large burials come in many shapes and forms. They all get kind of slotted as megaliths, which, as I mentioned, is a really is a term that lumps a range of practices together and makes them appear much more uniform than they are. But in most megaliths, I'm just going to go with that name because I don't know, it's just what we inherit actually from a very long kind of disciplinary practice. Megaliths often have ceramic vessels in them. The number of vessels that are found, the ways in which they are arranged, and also the range of vessels themselves may differ. They're also not the only goods that we find in these burials. They often contain iron. This burial that you saw the image of also contained an kind of iron dagger. And another burial that we excavated at the same time as this one, which was a kind of salvage excavation. It was very ruined, so we didn't find any ceramics. I think a lot of the burial was just missing due to modern day sand quarrying activities. But we found ornaments in that burial, so that's another thing that can be found in these contexts. Otherwise, a lot of burials that are not megaliths, in the sense that they're not associated with these kind of arrangements of stones, are urn burials. Urns are ceramic urns, so they're basically pots in which the remains were interred.
Okay.
Yeah.
Manikanta Chodishetty wants to know any methodologies be applied to figure out what these ceramics might have carried or used for, like seed residue, pollen, oils, etc.
Yeah. To my knowledge, this hasn't been done on, I think maybe Smriti knows, she's more keen into the megaliths. But I don't know of anybody who has done residue analysis on pots from southern India. I know people who are working on these kinds of projects at Indus Valley sites that are currently being excavated in Haryana. But yeah, not that I know of. I mean, we don't know if there was something in the pots, but it's a really good question. You know, it would actually be very significant to understand whether people were buried with empty pots or full pots. You know, that's a big difference in terms of how people were conceptualizing how to produce this kind of ritual and, you know, inter a human body with all these grave goods. This was obviously a very elaborate burial, the one that you saw images of.
Yeah, I think there are like a few instances where they found like husk or grains within the pots, but I haven't heard of any residue analysis done either. But Arvind, can I just ask one question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Not my question though. There is a question from Shalini Vineet. He wants to know what's the time period when ceramics first appeared.
In India? So I can just talk generally. I mean, the stuff that I spoke about right in the beginning of the presentation, which is really the oldest known ceramics that seem to come from East Asia, from China, and especially from Japan, can be as old as 10,000 or 9,000 BC. So really we're talking about, you know, well before the development of any kind of settled life and farming communities anywhere in the world. In India, we see pottery emerge much later. In the south, probably in about the 3rd millennium BC, the earliest pottery that I know of is Neolithic. And in the north, it's a little bit earlier. Yeah.
I think
not by much.
Related question is like oldest dated ceramic found in Karnataka. Any idea?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, you can't really date ceramics. You can only date the context from which you get the ceramics. I mean, there are ways of dating ceramics, but we don't generally use them because radiocarbon is much more reliable with pieces of wood, I think, but wood charcoal or other kinds of burnt remains. But as far as I know, it would be the Neolithic ceramics from the 3rd millennium BC.
Okay. And has there been any scripts on post-fired pottery?
Yeah, there is some graffiti that was noted even on the pottery from Brahmagiri, I believe. I think the earliest instances of graffiti are from uh, maybe the late first millennium BC.
Is it possible to trace the paths of ancient migration by studying pottery? It's Sundara Velavan question.
Yeah, I mean, so studying migration is actually a very kind of key component of what I described as culture history, because the entire idea of how cultures evolve and change is actually rooted in migration. There is no understanding within the framework of culture history that communities may actually change somewhat more organically. They're always either kind of replaced by an outside invading force, or culture is spread by what is called diffusion, which is actually analogous to migration. So when people move, they kind of take their culture with them. They're carrying their culture and they spread it. Sounds really funny to say in the time of coronavirus, but but I would. There are places that a lot of places in the world where people have conducted studies of how kinds of pottery spread in different places, especially I think in the classical world, where different types of pottery are. It's very well understood where pottery was produced, where it came from, when it was produced. And so there's kind of, there's a fine resolution to work with there. I don't think it is the most, interesting or kind of analytically sophisticated approach, primarily because of the kinds of assumptions that it makes about the relationship that people have to the objects that they use.
Sonal Karanjikar wants to know how back the study of ceramics take back the history of South India, which you have already answered. But he also wants to know, are the sites mapped for us to have a look at?
Are the sites mapped?
Mapped, yeah.
Yes, to varying degrees. I mean, you can find maps that show, for instance, the distribution of certain features, such as Ashokan Edicts or Ashmounds or Megaliths. So it's possible to put these places on a map, but whether the sites are mapped spatially in and of themselves, like this was a house, this was a something else. No, many of them are not. Sites where excavations have been conducted would be a good place to start, with the excavation reports.
Right. Okay. Hemant Kadambi has this question. A comment and a question. The pottery town example is fascinating. What can one learn about archaeological ceramics by studying contemporary production and consumption of ceramics?
Yeah, thank you, Hemant. Hi. So a few things. There's in the presentation there were two kind of contemporary examples. One of them was the one from Pottery Town, which I was trying to use to show just how potters come together, even though they have their own individual, workshops or places where they're actually making the pottery. But for the really kind of resource intensive and also riskiest, I think, part of the production process, which is firing, they actually decide to pool their resources and do this together. And I think that there's something very significant about the way in which that professional relationship is also a social relation, right? And so even though we cannot get to the specificities of that in the particular context that we have, because it's been hard to identify just the ways in which people fired pottery and things like that. I think it at least opens the imagination to say that these kinds of relations existed and are actually a very kind of common part of work, of labor. Which I think we kind of instinctively also know from our own lives, right? The other contemporary example was of the potters in Niger who have been, which is an example that I draw from the archaeologist Gosna, who is practicing what is called in archaeology the chaîne opératoire approach, which is to try to understand the kind of sequence of operations, the chain of operations by which any kind of labor is done. And this is used quite extensively to understand how pottery production works. And, when we study ceramics, we are not privy to the kinds of decisions that potters would have made. At each stage of the process, we only see the result of the traces of those, the results of those decisions, right? And again, it just opens the mind to the various ways in which, at each step, variation exists, right? And I think, to just take that back to the whole kind of discussion of culture history. Again, these studies show us that that variation is actually a very complicated thing, and it can be quite small and fine-grained, and especially in something that is as embodied as the making of pottery, right? Even the size of the potter's hand matters. Yeah.
Can I just jump in? Sorry. I just have another question also by Hemant, which I think is a really interesting question. Maybe hard to answer, but it's interesting, is how many ceramic vessels would one require to study to understand social practices? Let's say one particular kind of issue, such as the number of people in a family.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay, that's hard. That's really hard because we don't get kind of raw numbers from an excavation unit. So, for instance, one of the units that we excavated was a house, which you saw a couple of images of, especially maybe closer to the end, kind of plate embedded in a floor. So what happens in this kind of domestic space is a house is a very maintained space. So, which means that that it's swept. People are not living with all their rubbish all the time, and so that in itself makes it really hard to reconstruct these things, I think, because not only is there use of a particular range of vessels. It's very interesting. The things that we found in the domestic context are actually really different from what we find just 100 meters away from it, close to a well. But we also found a significantly smaller quantity of pottery in the domestic space than we found close to the well, which is, I think, what I'm talking about when I say that it's hard to arrive at raw numbers, because the space is being maintained in a way that, that outside communal space is not being maintained with the same care that the house is being maintained. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to say about how many you would need. And there are all sorts of discussions in, I guess, in the literature that comes out of formation theory, and use lives and things like that, that talks about that again, to go back to your question about what studying contemporary practices can tell us about the archaeological context that we investigate. It's something like this, right? How many pots do people use? How often are they discarded? Where do they discard them? They probably don't throw them in their house. They probably throw them somewhere else. And whether, you know, the same pot is used for you know, many different tasks, or if the assemblage is very internally differentiated, that you would use, you know, something for, you know, X operation and a different kind of pot for Y operation. That's difficult to establish in all situations. So there are a lot of factors to be taken in account for this. I think mostly to do with discard, actually. Also appears that some pots would be discarded with greater frequency than others. You know, you use something a lot, it might break faster, has to be thrown away and a new one purchased. So you actually get, in the archaeological record, what you'll end up with is a greater accumulation of that kind of pottery, which doesn't necessarily mean that many of those similar pots were in use at the same time, but just that people kept repurchasing them, they kept replacing them. And others we might find more singular instances of, because, you know, maybe it was like a storage jar that sat in a corner and didn't break for a really long time.
Smriti, do you have any questions? Otherwise, there's one question, and I think we will end with it.
I do have like something that follows up with it. Do I have time to like ask him?
7:50. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So, I mean, I was thinking in terms of like Hemant's question and what you were saying, I think it's also useful to think in terms of at excavations. I think there were practices sometime back where there was a lot of selecting of ceramics done during the excavation. So I think in some ways his question also goes to ask, how do you decide what ceramics you keep and what you discard in the field and what you take for analysis?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess I'll just say the really trite thing about how archaeology is always about sampling. Or maybe any kind of research is always about sampling, right? That there's always an aspect of sampling that is involved. There's an aspect of choice that is involved. I mean, when I say that we excavated a house, what we excavated was a 1 meter by 1 meter hole in the house, which is not a large space, right? But at least from that space, because we analyze everything, or because we at least keep everything and know the volume of ceramics that came out of that space, we can come to some sort of broader conclusion about the volume of ceramics that may be located in such a context, in, you know, say a bigger if we had done a bigger excavation unit, which of course also depends on the kind of space that it is, right? As I said, this unit yielded much smaller volumes of ceramic than a unit that was in a kind of communal space. So what happens with excavation and sampling is that you're always sampling when you excavate, but when you only keep ceramics and only keep them judgmentally, a kind of extra layer of sampling is added, and one that is much harder to calibrate because it's impressionistic, and based on and basically comes from, you know, all the kind of biases of sight, size, you know, bright colors, wanting to collect you know, rim sherds or things that would help you construct form. And of course, if your research is about the forms of vessels, then that could be very useful, if that's really all what you want to investigate. Yeah.
Okay, there's one last question. what are the different, Kumanan wants to know what are the difference between Iron Age pottery found in Karnataka and in Tamil Nadu / Kerala? Are the red and black where found?
In Karnataka, yes. I don't actually know about Tamil Nadu and Kerala. I think that's a question that Smriti will be more equipped to answer. But in Karnataka, the typical Iron Age assemblage is red slipped and polished wares, black slipped and polished wares, which are mostly bowls, and vessels which are slipped red and black, either inside and outside. So one side is red, the other side is black, or on the same side, so that the two colors are applied, either one on top, the other below, or side to side, and subsequently polished.
Smriti, do you want to add anything about tomorrow's talk, and then we'll end with that? Or
Yeah, sure. So tomorrow's talk, if you've seen the schedule, is by Sharda Srinivasan, who will be talking about archaeometallurgy. There may be some changes to her title, but she'll tell us tomorrow, but it will be on archaeometallurgy. So yeah, we're looking forward to having her with us tomorrow at the same time. Was there anything else you want to add, Arvind?
no, I would like to thank Mannat for joining us.
Thank you.
It was very fascinating, and of course, all the participants. Thank you very much for being there today. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.